wanted to say something about just sort of prefacing our conversation, because we're at that part in our series where we're talking about pardon and penance, which is old language for the work of repair, really. Hope and repair. In Taylor's language, she says, after confession, after self-disclosure, pardon comes next. And without it, we wouldn't have any ability to go through the process of penance, of repair, because there would be no promise that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So that's where we're sitting, and to tell that story and how that plays out, maybe in real life, involves risk. Mm-hmm. And also, for many of us, a story that doesn't look especially pretty.
Exactly.
And so sometimes in this setting, when I do a bit of self-disclosure and it's not especially pretty, I get some interesting responses from people. Sometimes people, it's like that illustration in Taylor's book where the mother and son are at an AA meeting and he's disclosing some of his actions while he was addicted. And the author wants to cover the mom's ears, not because anyone's telling a lie, but because it's not pretty. And so sometimes when I do self-disclosure, I'm aware that people are like, could you just stop now, Jen? Like, it's too, that happens. Another thing that happens is people then rush me after the service and they're like, are you okay? So I just wanted everyone to know that you and I are both professionals. We have resources.
And we are okay.
We are okay. Yeah, they don't need to caretake us.
Exactly.
And if you have a feeling that comes up for you, maybe check yourself about, I wonder why I'm feeling what I'm feeling, and how does it relate to you rather than us?
Just this morning I was thinking about, Jen, the kind of the public confessions, the format that the church has traditionally taken, and how leaders or parishioners sort of shame people back into the fold so that our anxiety is alleviated. If you're behaving as you're supposed to, then my anxiety is...
Yeah. Oh, that's so true.
...is alleviated.
It's like projection.
Exactly like projection.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I realized when Jen invited me to converse with her this morning that it would be helpful to provide some context, some framework for what exactly this conversation is about, or else it wouldn't make much sense. And so I just wanted to spend just a moment providing kind of a foundation, a framework, and then we'll delve into the conversation about penance, repair, hope. As many of you know, I've been a mental health professional for the greater part of the last decade. And when I graduated from a graduate school in 2010, all of my professors, actually all of the professors in the School of Counseling got together and they nominated me to be the Marriage and Family Therapy Student of the Year. And so I was, with this great honor, sort of thrust into the profession, knowing that others who were much more advanced than I saw potential in me. And then began the grueling work of very quick learning, being thrown into the deep end of the pool, how to be a much better clinician. And working toward licensure took a lot of money and a lot of time. And then I spent the next several years working as a mental health professional in several different clinics and for a bit of time in my own private practice. My most recent position was at the Oregon State Penitentiary, working with maximum security inmates, very dangerous felons. And what I encountered there was an extreme deprivation of support, of resources. So they would say, we want pro-social behavior, but we're not going to give you the supports you need to engage in pro-social behavior. So these counseling sessions I was able to do with these inmates were like gold to them. Finally, somebody to hear me and see me and offer me something of hope, of change, of wisdom. Well, the combination of the extreme deprivation along with my underdeveloped parts of myself, or the younger parts of myself, or the broken parts of myself created a toxic mixture for me, and I ended up becoming inappropriately emotionally involved with a couple of the inmates. I left the penitentiary for unrelated reasons. And shortly afterward, the licensing board approached me and said, "We're going to put you under investigation. And this is for some egregious ethics violations." And of course, it was then that the world beneath me began to crumble. I ended up negotiating with my lawyer, working with my wife. After many tearful, sleepless nights, we decided it was best for me to surrender my license in exchange for them dropping the investigation against me. I won't go into an elongated version of the story. However, I want to say that my last day of practicing, on a Wednesday, they said no more practicing on Friday. So I wrapped up the entire caseload, and on Friday, when I closed the door, I had an envelope in my hand, and in that envelope was my counseling license. And I drove to the post office, and I dropped it in the box.
Wow.
Yeah, it feels sad even saying it now.
Something that has been so striking to me, and the reason I knew I wanted to have this conversation with you, is because about 2 years ago, you came into my office to have a conversation with me, and you told me this story. And it was so evident to me that you had that in that sort of classic scheme that Taylor sets out, you were confessing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'd already confessed to some of your most intimate people and to yourself. And now you were practicing this act with me. And in the narrative you told me, I also was really aware that you were into the penance piece of it. You were into the repair part of it. With a lot of energy. Like, here's the fracture, and here's the repair work that I'm about
currently
to do.
Doing.
Yeah, without sort of like blaming anyone else or trying to put any of it off, just here's what I'm doing. And that same week, I had another confession, kind of a similar confession, come into my office. Fracture, an intimate relationship involved, and the way that person presented their story to me. So here's the confession, and then there's, now what can I do to keep this under wraps? And I was like, wow. It was such a stark contrast, two different ways to handle fracture. So you talked about, I saw it on Facebook this week, you said like a loss of professional identity is part of how you, can you talk about what that was like?
Yes, I recognized very early that this was a matter of public record. There was really no hiding this. I mean, I suppose I could have tried to hide it, but it became really apparent very early on that I need to do, if I was going to do this appropriately and really to honor the work I'd been doing with people for a number of years, I really needed to be transparent. And so what I did is I basically said to myself, if this person, friend, acquaintance, colleague, family member, were to find out about me losing my license from some other source, would trust be broken between us? So that was sort of the gauge that I used, the framework that I used to determine who I needed to speak to and who I didn't need to speak to.
What was that like?
Terrifying. I immediately re-entered counseling for myself. And I'm so thankful for great mental health professionals. My therapist recognized right away what an immense support system I had around me. And she said to me, probably the two most powerful words I've heard in my own personal therapy ever. And that was, lean in. You have love around you. Lean into that love. And that was the exact opposite of what I wanted to do, which was to hide, to cover, to recoil.
Yeah, I want to know what it is. Like, what was the thing in you that gave you the ability to lean in and to continue leaning in? Because I think you're still doing that.
I am.
As opposed to that maybe
Recoiling.
like instinct to be like, let me make this secret. Let me keep it.
I have for years experienced within myself and witnessed with hundreds of people with whom I'm sitting across from sharing very shame-filled stories, what it means to step out of that shame and to be loved. Really have done a lot of work around that. I was coming from a place in many ways of already being a loved person. So what that provided for me was the resources, the internal resources I needed at that time or during those times to be able to step out knowing that I wouldn't die. Because our brains really do tell us, if I share this, I will die. This is why we have such strong physiological responses to trauma. So a lot of years of work, a lot of internal work that I've done with myself, as well as witnessing over and over and over and over the sort of formula that if I share, if I'm in the light, if I'm open, and I have supportive people around me, or maybe even if I just have one supportive person around me, or many times the inmates had like a book, like Nelson Mandela. Do you know how many times I told people to order Nelson Mandela books so they could have an inspiration, a resource? Whatever you need to reflect back to you, you are loved. You are loved.
So you had that initial, I don't know how long it was, a couple of weeks, maybe longer than that, of like having to go through that list of who do I need to tell? How am I going to tell? And that's like the beginning of the work,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So what is the work like now? Is it over? Are you done?
It will never be done. In those first days, I thought, and I said to my wife, baby, I can see why public figures commit suicide when scandal hits the news. My life wasn't nearly as public, but I felt acutely self-conscious and shame-filled in many ways. I thankfully wasn't suicidal, and I did have a great number of people around me that offered great support. I was telling Jen, if you're ever going to fail morally, if you want to use those words, do it around a bunch of therapists, because these people are amazing and they know how to respond in helpful and healthy ways. And so I really did have that advantage, if you will. The work is not done. My wife and I, as recently as the last 2 weeks, have shed tears over ongoing work that we continue to do.
Something you said so beautifully to me earlier this week is that you have to continue to hold the self-disclosure.
Yes, the fracture. Hold the fracture.
Yeah.
Hold the fracture. So somebody comes to me and says to me, I am feeling disappointed by your behavior, or I feel betrayed by you, or I'm experiencing a lack of appreciation for you because you've shamed our profession, or something along those lines. My job is not to provide excuses or explain where I was coming from. My job is to hold the fracture, to hold space for that person to be upset and to acknowledge and love and affirm and say, yes, I messed up. I hurt us. And in my marriage, that's generally what I've done over and over and over and over. As many times as my wife has come to me saying, I feel sad or hurt or betrayed about this thing, I'm still holding this fracture, which is healing, incidentally, and affirming, yes, I hurt us. No excuses. None.
And that's so counterintuitive, I think. We just don't know. It's so hard to know how to do that.
It is so hard. And really, I think the trick is to have supports elsewhere where you can say, this is what set me up to fail, because there were certainly things that set me up to fail. This is where I was justified in this portion of my behavior, or this is where my own internal lack of development played into my choices. But in the broken relationship is not the place to express it. They don't care or need to hear it.
And it strikes me, I just want to remind people that this isn't like something that happened 2 weeks ago or 6 months ago.
Years.
We're talking about the months and months of work that you've put into being able to tell this story the way you're telling it right now. You said something about moral failure a moment ago, and I was thinking, well, yeah, I guess maybe this thing, if we were a stereotype, like what happened, it's a piece of moral failure, but are you aware of where that fracture is or lived in you that wasn't about moral failure, but was about vulnerability or your own woundedness or your own brokenness?
Absolutely. Essentially what happened is I had weight loss surgery, and my clients, the inmates, started to notice me, and I was like, oh, this is a different experience. So then the 13-year-old me arrives on the scene and begins to take over. I've said to my therapist, to my wife, to friends, I almost wasn't even aware of the behaviors I was doing. So when my friend said to me over and over, see, everything you did was visible. Everything you did, somebody could see. What were you thinking? And the answer is I wasn't. Right. I was acting under the compulsion of a very underdeveloped part of me. Is essentially what it was.
And I think that's just true for most of us. A lot of us don't have, I'll say a lot of us don't have the crisis moment that you had, where, like when Matthew last week was talking about bleeding out on the floor. I thought about how similar that is to your story. Something happened that you had zero ability to control what the outcome was going to be. So you got forced into having to go on this journey. And so part of the question is, would you have gotten down there to that fear, that 13-year-old girl, whatever she was holding, without being forced?
No. Barbara Brown Taylor says, God knew, this is about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God knew they had to eat the fruit. It was the only way they would wake up so they could make real choices from then on. I'm much more awake is essentially what it is. Yeah, it had to happen in a weird, convoluted way. I'm a much better person for it.
More human.
More human.
Yourself. More, yeah?
Kind of an icky road to travel.
Yeah. It would be nice, I guess, if we could get there without the hard stuff, but the hard stuff seems to be so necessary for most of us.
Yes.
However, most of us aren't truthful about the hard stuff.
True. I was really struck last week by Matthew saying, when you asked, have you ever experienced a church in which this kind of authenticity is experienced? And he thought for a moment and he said, no. Yeah. So really, if I were to walk into an AA meeting, for example, and tell this story, they would say, and what else you got? That's like nothing compared to what I've done. but in a church, sharing really authentically is very, very scary. And that harkens back to what you were saying at the very beginning, Jen, which is your mistakes really shake my sense of stability, which is a whole different issue for us to address within ourselves.
Yes. I was thinking about how your people responded to you initially when you had to do this confession.
Yes.
Can you tell a bit about?
They're sitting here. My besties showed up today. Among the first people that my wife and I told, I think maybe the first were our besties who live a block from us. And we went down and talked to them and shared with them. And they were my initial, and continue to be in many ways, my refuge. And then most recently I knew, as I've shared about the confirmation class and kind of the cohesive unit that we've developed over the last year, it was becoming more and more urgent for me to share with the older adults in my confirmation class, not to be confused with the younger adults that are in the class or the young people. And so I had felt this urgency, if I'm going to be in community with my people, they kind of need to know who I am. And I hadn't really shared recently because I'm sort of in relationship with the same people in many ways. But the confirmation group was new on the scene. And so then when you asked me to share today, to converse with you today, I thought there's no way I can talk about this without the confirmation group even knowing. That's kind of shady. And so a couple of weeks ago, we had dinner in our home, and I was able to share with the confirmation group. So they're here as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that you had a pocket within this faith community that you could practice that act of self-disclosure with. And I think in the scheme of things, what you received from Robin, what you received from your friends, I hope what you received from the confirmation class, that's where pardon comes into play. Mm-hmm. Pardon is, I see you, I love you. I'm not going to confuse this thing, this action with your identity.
Mm-hmm. It's easy to confuse the two.
So easy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, she's the one that...
Right. And we're running out of time, but I think there's also a story you have to tell about how your professional identity, your projected self in your professional world got mixed up with beloved C. Mm-hmm. And what it takes for that to be in shambles.
Yes, I was the therapist. I was the therapist. I embodied a therapist. And really, truly, when you take therapist out of C, there's actually quite a bit that remains. Mm-hmm. Who knew? Mm-hmm. And so this professional crumbling and rebuilding that has been taking place has been quite a complex and beautiful journey. And I'm not sure which story you're referring to. However, I was recently accepted into the chaplaincy program at Riverbend Hospital. And so I'm taking a shift in my helping profession, and my end goal at this point, at least, is to be a hospice chaplain, sitting with people in a different kind of trauma than what I used to do. Jen, I forgot to mention to you that in the early days, and I've forgotten about this as well, in the early days of confession, there were 3 women from this church that reached out to me. One was Rhonda, and she said, Rhonda Mueller-Warren, she said, I would love to go to coffee with you, and then a couple others as well. I would love to go to coffee with you, and I was a little bit scared. Are they going to chastise me? And no, it was really just a matter of connecting. I want to hear your story, and I want to share parts of myself that might encourage you. Those were some early beacons of light that really helped me.
Yeah. I wonder why, can you imagine having, can you imagine telling you are right now, but like Matthew said, when I said, do you find in church what you find in AA? And he's like, no. Could you have imagined in maybe your prior church experience going through this journey of repentance and ending up where you are now within the context of a faith community?
No, I would have been in front of a church confessing my sins and going through a process of restoration, doing penance of a different kind. And then a group of people would decide whether or not I was worthy based on my behavior,
right?
If I was worthy of re-entering some sort of visible role in any kind.
I'm wondering for all of us, I know that it brings up stuff for us when we hear someone being so truthful, so honest in the context of community. And I wonder if we can wrestle a bit with the question of why can't we tell the truth in this kind of setting, in the setting of a faith community? What stops us from saying, hi, my name is Jen, and I'm an... What stops us from that? Do you have ideas?
I've thought about this whole week since Matthew said what he said last week. A long history of shame, puritanical, and it's sort of this layer of morality really messes us up. Because if you go into an AA meeting, they don't care about morals. What they care about is your process. So it becomes less about the content. C lost her license because of X, Y, and Z, and much more about the process. C is working to restore relationships in this way and living a more authentic, visible life in this way. That's the only thing I came up with. It confuses me too, Jen.
Well, I think similarly in the church, it's just so much easier to not be in the process.
Yeah, you can show up, play church, leave. We've been doing it for decades, right? I have.
So it's kind of almost, it's also kind of easier to be a person in that way too.
Yeah, you can be pretty.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The process is so much harder and so much.
Right, engaging.
Yeah.
Showing up to the table. Showing up to the table.
I have this, it will be interesting to me in your hospice experience, what you learn about people who are dying. Some of the saddest stories I hold are being with people who are dying at the end of a long life, people in their 90s who say, I don't really know who I am. And I think that's the difference between playing the role of being human and being fully human.
There's a lovely article called The 5 Regrets of the Dying, and she may have even written a book about it. As a hospice nurse, sort of compiled decades of nursing experience into 5 regrets that people had, among things like, I should have worked less and spent more time with my family. And the one that resonated so much with me is I should have thought less about what other people think.
Yeah.
I really don't want to get to the end of my life not really having engaged, not have lived.
Yeah.
That would be tragic.
Really sad.
It's
really
5 Regrets
sad.
of the Dying.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.